Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, 60 glorious minutes of multifaceted discussion where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and we feature the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyagolu. Coming up in the next hour, as a new book about fashion and communication investigates why we wear what we wear and argues that fashion is one of the most powerful tools of communication in the world today. We'll speak to the London-based author about how the international language of clothing literally and figuratively reveals our lives. And later, as the first ever Russia-Africa summit draws to a close in the Black Sea resort of Sochi, attended by nearly 50 African leaders, including the heavy hitters from Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa and Ethiopia, we ask what's behind Moscow's ambitions in Africa. Why is it making this push into the continent at this time, and what's in it for Africa? As some critics describe Russia as the clumsy latecomer at Africa's superpower party, we'll get the assessment of two top analysts in a moment. Now, fashion, they say, is an international language and a global business. It is the layer that literally and figuratively reveals our lives, the way we communicate, the signals we send out, and the camouflage we use to obscure our appearance. According to the experts, among all objects of design, our clothes are the most universal and intimate. Like other kinds of design, fashion thrives on universality and self-expression, and it can have profound social, political, cultural, economic, and environmental consequences. There are garments from all over the world, each with its own history and meaning. Well, a new book, Fashion as a Means of Communication, by the Israeli-Nigerian lawyer and writer Hava Rosenfield, has brought the language of fashion into sharp focus once again. The book investigates why we wear what we wear and why we should appreciate fashion as one of the most powerful tools of communication in the world today. Well, in a moment, we'll speak with the author herself. Well, for more about fashion and why we wear what we wear, I'm joined now from our London studio by the Israeli-Nigerian lawyer and author of Fashion as a Means of Communication, Hava Rosenfield. Hava, good to see you there, and it's good to finally get you on the telly here, because I know we've spoken about this a number of times, and we were trying to sort of arrange the schedule so they would fit. So there you are, and I'm glad that you're there. But let me start by asking you this. Clothes are, of course, objects of fashion and a means of self-expression, but your argument, and the argument of a number of people like you who are fashion philosophers, as it were, is that it goes beyond that to the deepest philosophical questions of who we are and how we see ourselves.
Hi, Charles. Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I'd like to say thank you, and I'm very glad to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation, as it's one that I try to have with as many people as I possibly can, whenever and wherever. I definitely think that fashion transcends the everyday visuals that we find around us. I think it reflects our thought process, it reflects who we are, and it's essentially a form of identification. It's one of those forms of identification that I feel nobody is really able to not take part in. Because at the end of the day, we all have to have some kind of item on our body that would represent where we're going, where we've come from, and the kind of activity we're going to partake in, and things of that nature. So it's something that I find everybody partakes in, regardless of people who think they are above fashion, in a sense that fashion might be superficial for the more serious minds. And I clearly disagree with that, because as a lawyer myself, I don't think that the fact that I'm very interested and have a passion for fashion, as they say, makes me any less serious and any less interested in my career path.
Yes, I suppose so. And so in a sense, clothing is a distinguishing mark that sets us apart, really, from other animals. I mean, it is something that makes us human, whether it is the expression of happiness or, as somebody put it, in the cruelty of clothing. And we'll get to talk about that, hopefully, in a few minutes.
Yes, absolutely. It is the distinguishing factor because at the end of the day, we are all, species. We all share the earth. But one of the things that we consider ourselves as humans to have done is evolved, and that includes our fashion and the sense of fashion that we've evolved with. Fashion is particularly interesting because of the evolution of it, because what started out as essentially a form of protection against, the weather and other kinds of earthly things that affect our health, has become something that it's intrinsic to every aspect of our lives. It no longer just reflects the weather, it reflects our thoughts, the colors we like, it reflects the kind of people we are, the image and the messages that we want to share with the world depending on the day, depending on the event. And another thing about fashion is people seem to mistake it with style all the time. Style is a lot more personal, and that would be maybe another level of evolution, you can say. But fashion in itself is very generic. There's quite a large multitude of what fashion can mean. But essentially, we choose what we wear based on the activities we surround ourselves and we partake in. And this can be reflected in the way that we speak about fashion, in the way that we relate to fashion, and how we essentially see fashion in general. Because a lot of us think that it's not necessarily a priority, and regardless of that, we expect people to look a certain way. And this could be seen in the workplace, it could be seen at particular social events, so people are expected to present themselves somehow. Regardless of that, we're not supposed to put too much emphasis on fashion, and I think that is in itself contradictory.
Right. Okay. Well. I mean, that's a very
sure
interesting point that you're making, Hava. I mean, let's talk about specific types of clothing. The suit, for instance. I mean, I'm obviously wearing one. I think you're probably wearing one in London. I'm not sure because I can't see sort of all of you. But I mean, the suit appears to be particularly good at masking and concealing. I mean, I've heard it argued that suits are the uniform of people like bank managers, estate agents, lawyers like yourself. I'm sure you wear it every day. It has also become a sort of uniform of masculinity that conceals a lot of things. And if you're in trouble, for example, you'll wear a suit to a court of law because the suit gives you a sort of respect and authority or a dignity that you may not have without it.
Agreed, Charles. It is a fact of life at this point because it's something that has evolved to where it is now over many decades. And the reality is wearing a suit really does mask us from any potential criticism. So you can wear a suit and you match and you suit the environment you're going into quite easily. It is definitely a uniform for the corporate world. And when you're not seen wearing a suit, it would appear that something's wrong with you or something has not really been right that day, or perhaps you have an event that you're going to directly from your office space. So absolutely, suits really do encompass what we call the uniform of the corporate world. I'm actually not wearing a suit. I'm wearing a blazer and a dress that I made many years ago. But I can see how that can come across as a suit from your line of vision.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you clarified that point. But yeah, and also I suppose what is interesting is that you're not just a lawyer, you're also very interested in fashion. You actually make your own clothes. But of course, when we're talking about the suit, it is just a facade, is it not? I mean, and there are times when that facade crumbles, doesn't it?
Yes, it is absolutely a facade. But the facade crumbling is not, it doesn't happen as often as you might think or might expect, because I think it's very ingrained in our system at this point, and people begin to wear suits without even thinking twice about it. It just becomes a part of the norm, it becomes a part of the culture and a part of your daily activity, of course, depending on where you have activities. But generally speaking, it is a facade, and next to being a facade, as well as being a facade, it's also a means of communicating the kind of activities we intend to partake in that day.
Right, okay, we've got a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to ask you about the cruelty of fashion, because there is the issue of women, for example, particularly in traditional societies. Is there the idea that women are subjected or subjugated in dress, that there is a history of restraining and constraining them in corsets or hijabs and so on? And if we're virtually out of time, so I may have to interrupt you, and you will continue talking about it after the break.
Yes, you're very right. At this point in life, fashion has mostly been made and forced upon women. We haven't really had the opportunity to express ourselves by ourselves, to make our own choices in terms of what we want to wear and how we want to represent ourselves. And this is partly due to bigger factors of life, such as maybe religion and culture. These play a very massive part in how we are expected to look as women, because as society has always been more patriarchal than matriarchal, it's unfortunate, but because of that, men have made more of a choice for women, and this has limited our expressions of ourselves. This has, in a sense, caused us to almost reduce what we would want for ourselves and just conform to what society wants to see instead.
Right, okay, that's brilliant. You hit the mark, and we're going to take a break. Stay with us, Hava. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our discussion with the author of a book about fashion and communication that investigates why we wear what we wear. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyagolu. Now, as someone said, it would be stupid not to take fashion seriously. When people get dressed, we tell the world all sorts of things about ourselves. So, in that sense, it could be argued that there is a sort of philosophy of dress, the possibility that clothes can be understood as ideas and language that over the years have ranged through literature, art, film, and philosophy. From the objectification of women to the crisis of masculinity, there is the hidden power of clothes in all the cultures of the world and in our daily lives today, each garment revealing the story of ourselves and how we dress to face the world.
We were all dressed by someone else. Parents picked out a t-shirt, the school dictated what colour our trousers should be. But at some point, we were granted the opportunity to discover who we might be in the world of clothes. We had to decide for ourselves about collars and necklines, fit, colours, patterns, textures, and what goes or doesn't with what. We learnt to speak about ourselves in the language of garments. Despite the potential silliness and exaggeration of sections of the fashion industry, assembling a wardrobe is a serious and meaningful exercise. Based on our looks or background, others are always liable to come to quick and not very rounded decisions about who we are. Too often, their judgment doesn't quite get us right. They might assume that because of where we come from, we must be quite snobbish or rather resentful. Based on our work, we might get typecast as dour or superficial. The fact that we're very sporty might lead people to see us as not terribly intelligent, or an attachment to a particular political outlook might be associated with being unnervingly earnest. Clothes provide us with a major opportunity to correct some of these assumptions. When we get dressed, we are in effect operating as a tour guide, offering to show people around ourselves. We're highlighting interesting or attractive things about who we are, and in the process, we're clearing up misconceptions. We're acting like artists painting a self-portrait, deliberately guiding the viewer's perception of who they might be. In 1961, the English painter Peter Blake portrayed himself wearing a denim jacket, jeans and trainers. He was deliberately nuancing the view most of his contemporaries would have had of him, based on knowing that he was a successful and rather intellectual painter. He might have been thought of as slightly aloof and highly refined, detached from and censorious of ordinary life. But his clothes speak about very different aspects of his personality. They go out of their way to tell us that he's quite modest. He's interested in talking about pop music. He sees his art largely as a kind of manual labour. His clothes, like ours, give us a crucial introduction to the self.
That's the fascinating world of fashion and communication. And with me from our London studio, the Israeli-Nigerian lawyer and author of Fashion as a Means of Communication, Hava Rosenfield. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us, Hava. Let's just talk about your book, Fashion as a Means of Communication. What's the central thesis of that book?
Yes, Charles. Well, in my book, I aimed to discuss and to analyze the degree to which fashion is relied upon to convey messages by certain media institutions. I focused on magazines and particularly magazine covers, and my intention was to understand, because regardless, it's a fact that they are using fashion as a means of communication. My question was to what extent and how much of their messages was relied upon fashion to get the message across.
And let's just, going beyond your book, just before we went on break, we were talking about the issue of the restraining and constraining of certain people in society by their cultures and so on. Is there a way, for instance, to dress women and make them appear to be less the victim, particularly in traditional societies, and to communicate the message to the world? And I think the designer Alexander McQueen, for example, comes to mind. He said that he designs clothes because he doesn't want women to look at all innocent or naive, but to look stronger. He said that he wants people to be afraid of the women he dresses because he doesn't want women to be taken advantage of because of the nettlesome issue of misogyny.
Yes, I personally think that the best way to help women dress to represent their best selves is to allow women to dress themselves. That's the bottom line here. I think it's a matter of choice. I think societies that inflict certain dress codes, and I'm not speaking of offices and more restrictive dress codes that refer to a particular line of work. I'm speaking of the general society and the general idea of always giving judgments depending on what a woman decide to wear depending on the day. And I think the bottom line here is to allow women to represent themselves, their true selves. It's a matter of choice. Of course, I'm completely fine with designers and male designers, but the bottom line, as Alexander McQueen said, it's about allowing a woman to really represent herself and really come across as strong, rather than as someone who can be perhaps walked upon. I think a lot of the world in the last decade, in fact, actually, in the last, in the last about century or more, fashion has become more and more open-minded in that sense. Women are less and less requested and required to dress in a certain way just so that they conform to what the male society would rather see them wearing. These days, the fashion houses are producing clothes that are intended to allow a woman to really be her real self, her true self, and come across with all the thought process that she put into picking out whatever outfit she chooses in that day. It's no longer relying on just having to conform to society, because otherwise there'd be repercussions.
Well, absolutely, but you mentioned history there. Can it be argued that historically fashion has been done to women, not for women and by women? Because if you think of the corset or even Chinese foot binding of women's feet, I mean, it was regarded as being more beautiful if women had tiny feet, even if those women couldn't walk.
Absolutely, Charles. I 100% agree. Since fashion has evolved to more than just a protective form of outerwear, of attire, it has essentially been done to women and not for women, which brings me back to my point about Alexander McQueen's quote, for example. It's very important that regardless of the sex of the designer, the fashion is constructed to allow a woman to be herself, rather than forcing a particular style or a particular ideology on a woman. It absolutely has been done, and it still unfortunately is being done in certain areas of the world. Which of course we can't do everything about at this point, but it's important to make more and more people aware of why women should be allowed, and allowed is even the wrong word really, because it's a right. It's a right to dress as one pleases and not bring along the judgments that come with that. It's not necessary. It doesn't evolve our society in any way. It doesn't bring us in any kind of advantage. It doesn't evolve us at all.
Well, let's move away from talking about the downside and talk about there is a certain, of course, joy and beauty of wearing clothes, because, I mean, they are the things that we wear that are closest to our bodies, aren't they?
Absolutely. Clothes, one of the best ways I like to identify is It's a form of art, really, because one looks at a piece of art and intends to interpret it, intends to go away with some kind of understanding, whether it be a preconceived understanding or a preconceived interpretation that you take away, or you just form your entirely new one. That's the same way that fashion can be seen, because what we essentially do is we speak a language, and this language carries vocabulary, it carries grammar, it carries all kinds of things. And by speaking, you're conveying certain messages, and to get those messages across, they need to be, to an extent, globalized, because you're speaking in codes. Just as you would find a baby girl wearing pink shoes and a baby boy wearing blue shoes, these are codes, these are forms of language. And these are positive forms of language, because at the end of the day, you're sharing a positive message. You have a baby, and the baby is of this sex or the other sex. And I think fashion can have its good points. It should only be good points at the end of the day, because it's something so colorful and something that really very philosophical. It really allows us it just allows us to express ourselves in the best of ways possible. And the fact that we've managed as a species to confine women rather than allow them, be free, using something so inherently positive is baffling to me, really.
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, the other point is that, we're talking about sort of the positive aspects of, the joy and beauty and all that of wearing clothes. And even when we die, for example, in the coffin, we often wear what is thought to be the most important thing in our lives, don't we?
Yes, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because even in death, we are still represented by our choices in life. The choice we made in life, to letting our loved ones know that we perhaps preferred one outfit over the other, one pair of shoes over the other. These choices follow us even in death, because that's how we are expected to be dressed in our coffins on our funeral days. And, that's the last image we give the world of ourselves.
Someone, of course, dresses us when we croak, but so in that sense, fashion is a form of protection against a sort of, there are people who see the protection against a hard and sort of abrasive world where people are constantly elbowing each other. I was looking at a documentary the other day about the football star Diego Maradona. I was listening to a program where they said that as the very first symbol of his success, he buys a fur coat. But by the end of his career, when he's really under a lot of big pressure, he has this enormous bearskin coat, which was interpreted as him being vulnerable and covering himself in the skin of a bigger animal.
And you've seen how powerful a statement he was able to make twice in a row, in a long period of time, because one would assume he had his success stage, and had a long period of success before things went, south for him. It's so interesting that he was able to convey a message without even words. He didn't speak. However, he did use a language, and that's the language of fashion, which clearly a lot of people from different backgrounds and different cultures were able to understand, because it is a global language. It is very international. There are many aspects of it that are essentially globalized and universal, and one could take away so many messages from this one fur coat versus the bearskin coat that he wore at two very different times in his life.
Okay, Hava, I want to thank you very much indeed. I just literally, I know your book is online, so people can Google it and get a copy of it. Hava Rosenfield is the author of Fashion as a Means of Communication. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including as the first ever Russia-Africa summit draws to a close in the Black Sea resort of Sochi. We'll discuss Moscow's push into the continent. Stay with us.